acknowledge our team, great team working on these topics. And then next, talk about the 5 points I would like to make today. So that's what we know about the contact of wildlife, domestic animals, and humans. What can we predict of that in the future? Then what we need for that are really wearables for wildlife, and also automated analysis in real time interactions, and it's the Internet of Animals. Next, so let's go to the contact, what we can do, what we can learn scale. Next, what during the anthropause is actually really exciting, because we know that humans have a massive influence on animals. So these data, this is a collaboration by the International Biologging Society. These data really show that we have data on human movement around the world, and next, also how that has changed in relation to the lockdown activities during COVID. And what we can, there are a lot of papers coming out on that, so showing this interaction between humans and wildlife, but also livestock. And next, what we can see already is that the movement of mammals, for example, is massively influenced by humans. This has become even more clear during the COVID lockdown. Next, and there are many unexpected situations, namely that the movement of animals is actually, in this case mammals, is actually decreasing with higher human footprint. So they are restricted in their movements. Now we also see direct interactions. Next slide. And this is, for example, a study where we only wanted to understand the movements of Himalaya griffins. Next slide, they're moving in Bhutan. In blue, you see the movement tracks of these Himalayan vultures in these high mountain areas. And we expected them to be really only in the Himalayas. But next slide, you see that they're going all across the Asian continent, all the way up to Mongolia and into China and all around Asia. Now, the resolution of these data, next slide, is so high, so precise, that we can really recreate the track in 3 dimensions and really understand the environment also. Next slide, even where thermals are in these mountains, where they go down foraging. Next slide. And now you see in the middle of this cluster an area, which I can't point out myself right now, but in the sort of middle lower part, you see an area where all of these, or many of these griffins come together. And what we found in many of these instances, and there's actually a trace that is really reproducible for these animals. Next slide, they are sky burials. So you can easily then see where animals and humans come together, even if they are going to these sky burials. Next slide. So this would be a video. But it doesn't matter. I think it's the important part is we can directly, by having these wearables on animals, observe how they interact with humans and what their interaction is. And in this case, we can also quantify that our griffins, some of them eat about 25% humans in these sky burials. The next slide. The key is that these wearables have become so powerful and so useful around the world. Next slide. That you can even use them on insects. Next slide, on bees, tropical bees. Next, on butterflies, or in the larger animals. Next, in white sharks, for example. You can even put cameras on top of their fins. Next one. Now this would be a video, but again, doesn't matter. It shows how a white shark surfaces and catches a sea lion. Next one. The data we get from that allow us to really recreate their movements in 3D, in near real time, For the ocean-going animals, it's a little more tricky, but for the land animals, it's now pretty much real time. That, for example, next one, allows us in elephants in Indonesia to really understand how much they eat, where they are, and what their behavior is. And that can be analyzed on the chip with artificial intelligence, even on the sensor on the chip. So next, you see that there are feeding or trunk movements in these animals, and that can be counted from your office anywhere around the world, can be shared among colleagues. We can also do that next for domestic animals or livestock. In this case, for example, a cat. These house cats can then be sent to a veterinarian if they scratch too much, or if they have fleas or whatever, if they don't drink enough. So this is now something that can be monitored very easily from these devices on board these animals. And even next, you can do that with brainwaves, so you can see when animals are sleeping, when they're active, and how active they are. Next, this is also possible non-invasively, really as a wearable for species that need to be rehabilitated and checked whether they are really safe. So, for example, the orangs in rehab stations can be traced by these devices. Next, they are getting so small that you can put them in as ear tags, electronic ear tags that function via solar cells and transmit from this animal, for example, over 180 kilometers to the next tower somewhere in the African savanna. Next, this is pretty important for animals that are problem animals if they leave areas, or I mean problem animals in the sense that they are interacting with humans to an extent that humans don't like. I guess then they are called problem animals. So that can be in lions next. And the good thing is these earmarks can stay in for a very long time, or even lifetime of these animals, and transmit the data and help the animals and help people. Next, these devices are becoming small enough that you can also put them on ocean-going animals. You still have to pop up the device and then send the data, but that's now also possible. Next, shows you how a rhino, an adult rhino, has a little ear tag or two ear tags, one in each ear, and then can communicate how stressed it is, whether it is healthy or whether something is happening in the environment that we should know about to protect it. Next, this is also really important for umbrella species for forest areas, like these macaws. And next, you can now do this really on a global scale, because these Internet of Things communication schemes are available not just on the ground, but through Icarus and other systems, also through space connections. We prototyped a new communication protocol that is extremely efficient, a two-way protocol next in the project Icarus, the International Cooperation for Animal Research Using Space, where we piloted that on the International Space Station. Next, at the time, you still needed a huge antenna because we wanted to make sure that we can receive these small devices. Next, here you see the pointing down, and this is now possible to satellites. So we are just now preparing the launch of the first microsatellite that is going up in about 12 months to replace the system on the International Space Station. Next. The idea is that you scan, like almost like a line scanner, you scan the surrounding. The tags can be dormant most of the time and are incredibly energy efficient. They select which data to collect from the animals, from the environment, and also interpret the data on board. So the satellites, and any satellite can do that if they are rightly configured, can then collect these data as an IoT system around the world. Next, the tags are versatile in that they can go on as a basic tag on all kind of animals like these birds, or next as a leg band on larger birds, or as I showed before, next as a fish tag that can pop up, or next as an ear tag, or next as a advanced tag that can have all kind of communication schemes for larger animals. Next, you have the tags in industrial production systems. They are now on the order of $250 or euros. They are becoming cheaper and cheaper, which is really important because they should be used on animals in these areas where it's really important, where wildlife and livestock and humans usually interact. So often in non-urban agriculture areas, but also in the future, obviously, more and more urban areas, as animals enter these areas more and more.
Es lo que usan con la estación satelital.
Sorry, Martin, I had to mute everybody. Could you please unmute yourself? Sorry about that. Somebody was speaking in the background.
Yes.
Thank you.
So the data next, the data we're getting from that around the world are pretty exciting. As I said, we don't have those data now because of the current world situation, but we're getting a new microsatellite that will give us the reception power back and allow us to do these readouts around the globe. Next slide, you see how this shows us how areas of the world are connected by the same species. In this case, these are data from common cuckoos that are moving from Norway or England or Kamchatka all the way to Southern Africa and meet there. So very exciting to really learn how these species come together. And this is within one species that is meeting down in southern part of Africa for wintering areas. Next. The data we're gathering from that are amazing. If you have them on European blackbird, for example, next. They can be released anywhere around the world, and then next transmit these data directly and in real time, almost real time. So we see for the first time how individual songbirds migrate over a continental scale. Next. But the key is that you understand what they are doing and where they come from and where they go to. So, for example, this bird came from the westernmost part of Russia and went to Great Britain. Next. So you see in Ribachi where it was hanging out, which houses it was visiting. So really like a tracing system for also obviously diseases or interactions. Next. Then you know where it landed in the UK, where it flew from there. Next. And this is all GPS accuracy. Next. You really see the individual bush and the individual house and the individual tree it's hanging out. Next. So this is really where we stand with the wearables. And I think that the key is now really also to have the analysis automated in real time. Next. And this is being done, for example, in MoveBank. It's a global, free for everybody, international database on animal movement and behavior. Lots of people have joined. Next. It has become an entire ecosystem of data where data from animals stream in via different systems. They are linked to environmental data from remote sensing systems. There are automated analysis modules. There are modules that allow you to directly interact with the data in the field and see where they are, and to link to other data systems via APIs. Next. The system has grown to over now already 4 or 5 billion locations around the world, also other sensor data. And I think now it's about 1,200 taxa, 1,200 species of animals that people have investigated around the world and are willing to share those data. Next. This means that in many areas of the world, we already have really 20 locations of animals on every square kilometer of solid Earth. About 10,000 animals are feeding live data every day. So the database is growing rapidly by the millions every day. Next. And as I mentioned, people can interact with this database through an app where you can really follow your animals, but also very importantly, you can send out amateurs and people around the world to say, well, an animal died here, please go out and, I mean, carefully investigate it, or you can send this message directly to some people in that area that you understand what's happening to these animals. So, for example, if a diseased animal is detected and is dying, you can send a vet out and say, please, here is a case, make sure that you are understanding what's going on there. Next. So there we also have 300,000 or 400,000 users by now all around the world. Next. And if you zoom in, there are probably many animals somewhere in your area, but overall, nevertheless, it's still a very low coverage of most areas in the world. Next. The automated analysis is done via move apps. This is a no-code analysis of movement and behavior in real time. So you can write, we can click together your own analyses in the move apps. Next. And this is done via workflows that you can either make public and share with other people or keep for yourself, but you have your analysis scheme set up that continuously and in almost real time analyzes your data, sends you messages, what's happening there, and is a community agreed way of doing analyses jointly around the world with the same methods. Next. So what this allows us is really to have predictions of these interactions. And I want to show you how amazing these predictions are. Meanwhile, if you look at storks, for example, next. Andrea Flack, a group leader in our institute, was able to study the interactions of young storks when they are first thermaling. And what she found was that within the first 10 minutes of looking at these data, next, you can really see massive differences between individuals. Next. And that's exciting because when you now look, for example, at the blue animals that are the ones that go up in the thermals really quickly, they are actually the ones that go across the Sahara into sub-Saharan Africa. And the ones that have lower thermaling abilities, they stay at home, either in Switzerland or in France or in Spain. But if you now look at the survival, next, then you see that the ones that actually now go across the Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa, even though they might be the strongest, they're the ones that are dying there because they are often shot or poisoned or otherwise are dying during their first or second year. But the key is that these analyses give us predictions on the lives of wild animals. And that is something that we need to really also predict these interactions and predict especially where diseased animals are going and interacting with livestock and humans. Next. This can be done on a global scale for raptors, for example. A study by Bart Kranstauber and Cameron Zaffi at our institute, looking at the migration routes for different raptor species and the global highways, the wind highways during fall migration. And that allows you to predict optimal migration routes along which most of these birds are migrating. Next. You can do this for raptors in general, but you can also do this for individual species. So, for example, if during an outbreak of avian influenza, certain species are most affected, you can actually predict where you expect them, where you should search for them, And this is also often in areas that are not well monitored. So that's why these predictions on a global scale, these temporal and spatially explicit predictions are really important. Next. It's also really important to get long-term data. Therefore, we have started, and this is grad student Sarah Davidson, the curator of MoveBank, to put together archives. And this is with the help of NOAA and NASA, Arctic Animal Movement archive over the last 20 or 30 years. Next. These are not necessarily all public data, but they share among these archives, and you can apply for having a look at these data or using these data. But the key is that for the first time, we now understand the temporally and spatially explicit differences in interactions in predator-prey across the Arctic and the interactions with the environment. And those have massive ramifications also for disease transmission, disease spread in these areas, and for the survival of these animals. Next. The same is true for bats. These are Eidolon straw-colored fruit bats in Kasanka National Park in Zambia. Next. We have investigated them again with these tags. Next. They get a tiny little backpack and then fly across the African continent. Next. They are pretty important for seed dispersal, really important for planting trees across Africa, literally tens of millions of trees, tens of millions of trees planted by these animals every night across Africa, and for food supply. Next, for local people. But it's also really important, next, that we can use them as sentinels for diseases, because we can look at their antibodies and antibodies in their blood that they accumulated over time from their youngest time, early ontogeny when they almost have nothing, to later on when they have a lot more. And then next, we can look at where they are going. So if some animals, say all animals that go through a certain part of Rwanda or Tanzania or Congo always have antibodies for certain diseases, they don't spread those diseases. I think that's really important to know that they only have antibodies, so they help us find the real host of these diseases. Next. Then we can say, for example, in the case here, if the animals that go along the red line always have certain antibodies for a certain disease, then we can narrow the search down for this disease into a certain area, and then continue to search for the real host. Next. I think that's also really important for avian influenza and other avian diseases that are of global importance. Here in mallard in Europe. Next. But they are not just hanging out in Central Europe, they are making large-scale migrations really quickly. In 2 weeks or so, they are through Belarus in Russia, or on the other hand, down in Western Europe. Next. Other species really connect areas, duck species connect areas across Eurasia. Or next, we can look at systems like Poyang Lake, where a lot of the farmed animals are interacting with wild animals coming through. And there's also the connection because of changing water levels with livestock and people. Next. But what we find is that we can even detect the low pathogenic avian influenza by a slight change, a population level change in body temperature over time. So we did this in an experiment where we had non-infected animals in Sweden interacting with wild animals, and then we see that when they are getting low path influenza infections, their body temperature rises. So what this can tell us then, next, is that we can, with the movement data and the environmental data that we get in real time, we can make predictions on where these animals should fly, which hubs they should have, where they should meet. And these are calculations by Marielle van Tor, who's now a postdoc in Sweden, allowing us to understand how animals connect continents during certain parts of the migration. Next. Another case is where you take an electronic ear tag, as I showed you before in the lion or the rhino. But in this case, you put it in a wild boar. Wild boars are notoriously difficult to track because they are in the understory, they are nocturnal, they almost have no neck, so you can't use a collar. But these new tags are so small and so powerful that an ear tag works super well. So Kevin Morell in our group, next, has done this for African swine fever, collaborating with a group in Spain that has a BL3 lab where you had infected animals. And you see that the infected animals have a much lower overall dynamic body acceleration, so they are much less active. And what you can see on the right is that after about 3 hours of infection, 2 to 5 hours, anywhere in that range, you can see that the change has already affected the behavior of these animals. So it takes only a few hours from infection to really tell us, oh, an animal is infected, it is now a carrier or transmitting or could transmit African swine fever because it has viremia. So a very exciting way to remotely detect these diseases. Next. Now, what can we do with all this information? We think that, I mean, obviously it's really, really important for One Health aspects, but it's going beyond that because we can build up knowledge about the planet's lifestyle of animals and life situations for animals around the world. For example, next, we can do this in species like geese that are flying long distances, connecting continents. We can measure the air that they're going through. This goose, for example, has a very high-powered device on its back that is measuring airspeed and wind direction and turbulence. Next. This is something that we calibrate in systems where we can fly these geese next to gliders. So we measure the air and on the glider with this sonic anemometer, but also with a device on the animal. And then we can really next do these kind of measurements on a global scale. So anywhere where these kind of animals are flying or other animals are flying. And this is often in areas next where you want these data and it's hard to get them, at least at that resolution. So it's very nice to have animals as Earth observation agents, not only for diseases, but also for changes of landscapes, which then indicates changes for other species. Next. This can also be done in insects now. For now, only on a local scale. For example, in the death-head hawk moths, a large nocturnal migrating insect. Next. Here you see one leaving Miles Mentz's hand on a nocturnal flight across the Alps. Next. Again, these tags showed us what the individual decision rules of these animals are. And I mean, as everybody knows, insects are super important for pollination, but also are invasive species. And they are affecting people around the globe every year. So what's important is not just these local rules that we have, but to do global observations. Next. This will be possible because there's a new system, Grace Eye, or the Mass Change Mission in the US NASA naming, that combines gravity and biodiversity measurements. This should be launched by February 28, 2 large-scale satellites that then run for about 6 to 15 years, depending on how things go. But the key is that then for the first time, we can really combine measurements on geophysics and ecology, and do this around the globe, but also have tags as small that we can observe, something like desert locusts. Next slide, which still, as you know, affect 1 in 10 people every year. Next slide. In huge areas around the world, many of the areas of the global south. Next slide. And these can be observed directly then with these tags, but also by their interaction with species like the storks or other birds that then not only tell us where tagged animals are, but also where other animals are that are getting off the ground in, say, the sands of the Sahara or in the Sahel areas. Next slide. This shows these interactions already. So stork movements, white stork movements from Europe, and their interactions, the red crosses with desert locusts in these areas in Africa. Next slide. But the Internet of Animals also gives us a really nice way to study what we call the sixth sense of animals. Can we go back one slide? Back one. Yes, so because there are emergent properties of interacting sensor swarms. And that is super exciting because, as everybody knows, I mean, if you have a cell phone in your car, just one cell phone doesn't help much, but if many people have cell phones, then you can predict the traffic. And you can precisely predict the traffic, and this is something that we didn't know 20 years ago. Now everybody is using that. So next, this is, I think, something that we can capitalize upon much more in the future as we have more intelligent sensors being linked together in the Internet of Animals. So for example, these rhinos in South Africa, next slide, where it doesn't help if we just have the rhino tagged, because the rhino tells us, oh, you know, I'm in trouble, poacher is here, okay, I'm dead now. But that doesn't help anybody much. So what we are planning to do right now, with funding from the Moore Foundation, next, is that we are not tagging the rhinos alone, but also the other animals around the rhinos. So in the right side, you see that zebras standing here for many other species, 20 other species or so that we are starting to work with, are being tagged. Next slide. And their nervousness, their interactions, or their reaction to diseases is actually allowing us to intervene, and intervene in near real time. So that means for the rhino, you send a ranger out to protect the rhino, to intercept the poacher. For diseased animals, you can send somebody out to treat them or to deal with them in whatever way necessary for conservation and management. And you can use that because you have intelligence on chip, so real AI on chip next, to solve problems such as the interaction of domestic cats and songbirds. Because next, we now have a system that allows us to onboard detect whether a cat is about to hunt a bird, and then the collar is emitting a warning signal of a bird. Basically, the cat telling all the birds in the area, I'm now about to hunt, be careful. And that is something that can solve, can save millions, tens of millions of birds every year, and allow for the interaction of these animals in a non-harmful or much less harmful way. Next. So I think we are now at a stage where, like Niels Holgersson, we can somehow electronically fly with animals around the world, or trot with them, or run with them, or swim with them. And I think the key is that we also have a very good feeling for their behavior, for their health status, and for their decision rules. And next, that means we can see the world through the eyes of these animals. We can have a much better glimpse of what's going on. We can predict what is going on. And I think that is super important for this entire One Health idea that you are all proposing. And I think if if we want to keep all animals and humans healthy and safe, then I think that's the way to go. So the last slide is one about the data in MoveBank. Unfortunately, it's not a video. It should be a beautiful video, the Earth turning around and showing all the tracks. But I guess you can imagine how that looks like. And I would like to, thank you very much for your attention and hope you have a lot of good questions.
Wow, excellent. Thank you so much, Martin, for this really, truly inspiring presentation. I think, just judging by some of the reactions, it's truly incredible. So yes, now we want to open the floor to questions, and there are already some in the chat. So I would just directly hand over to Robert Kless. Would you like to pose your question directly to Martin? It was like 3 times, so that's something that more people are thinking about.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Robert Kless, my name, Country Director of IFA Germany. And a huge thank you to you, Martin, for this fascinating presentation. I can see a lot of benefit also in the context of conservation and the animal movement, also in the context of the climate crisis and the change of the habitats to get our understanding where animal live, where animal moves, etc. So my question has been, all these, or at least a part of these data, are also publicly available, and I'm wondering how is it ensured, or it can be ensured, that poachers don't use these data as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a super important question. So the good part is that the data transmission from animal to receiver is safe, because we are not necessarily encoding the message itself, but encoding the location information and the behavior of the animal. So nobody can interfere there. And then downstream in MoveBank, I guess you can break every database if you put enough effort into it. But we're doing everything to keep it safe, and we've now run it for 12 years and nothing happened. What we can do is to protect these animals not only in the database, but also while streaming the data out to people on their cell phones. So if a manager in Kruger Park needs information about a rhino, she or he can get that on a secure line. And that has also worked really well so far. So we are constantly on the watch, our technical team, but we think it is as safe as it gets. We had no incidents so far, and we trust this will be the future as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Martin. Then I will just hand over to Ute Eilenberger. She has the next question. Would you like to pose it yourself, Ute?
Ja, hallo. Ich bin Senior Advisor im SV One Health und befasse mich auch mit Wildtieren seit vielen Jahren. Und ich würde mich mal interessieren, Mr. Wikelski, ob das politisch so ganz unproblematisch ist, zum Beispiel die Chinesen, wenn die mongolischen Vultures dort über die Grenze fliegen und getaggt sind und Daten zurücksenden. Kann ich mir vorstellen, dass das in China nicht gerade als sehr positiv aufgenommen wird. Können Sie was dazu sagen, weil Sie ja schon sagten, dass der Satellit im Moment nicht empfangen kann wegen der Weltlage. Ich nehme an, das geht da um den Ukraine-Krieg.
Yes, so the question was about the political ramifications of animals going between countries that are not necessarily friendly to each other. Well, we had one incident where a vulture with a German tag and an Israeli ring ended up in another country that doesn't like these birds to come in with an Israeli ring. But that got solved very quickly. We had some allegations that, during the start of the war in Ukraine, that people from the West are trying to infest animals, birds with avian influenza to send these diseases to Russia. It's completely ridiculous, obviously. So that's the good thing, I think, that the animals are independent. You can't control them, you can't direct them. So that's why I think it's not a major problem. And so far on on our level, the good thing is that all nations, all the ecologists in all nations have collaborated really well. And we didn't have just minor as well. But yes, I mean, we have to be careful, we have to be aware of that, but thankfully it's not an issue so far.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. So I'll just move on to the next question. Iris 4, would you like to pose your question directly? Iris from Pakistan?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And first, it was really a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for your time. So my question is about primate species, whether this technology has been deployed on apes and monkeys. And the reason I'm asking is because I work for a network of primate and wildlife sanctuaries, and some of these animals, after being rescued and rehabilitated, they will be released to the wild. And so obviously One Health approach is very important. And so I was wondering whether this technology has been deployed on these rescue primates or whether they can be in the future. Thank you.
Yes, so we were about to deploy the first tags. We have tags that are apparently functioning. We still need to test them. But then we had the stop of the data transmission from the Russian side to us after the war started. So that's why we have another year or 15 months before we can do the next real tests. But what we are doing meanwhile is actually to do non-invasive tagging. And that means, for example, this is a young group leader here at the Institute as well, Caroline Schüppli. She's working on orangs in Southeast Asia and developing a system to non-invasively tag them, to basically have a little nettle-like thing in their big beards that sticks on for a few days at least, so that you can learn about their whereabouts at least for a while. And having more permanent tags is something that we will get back to in about a year of time, but it's entirely doable, and it has had a lot of technical issues in the past because people tried to somehow implant things under the skin, but that doesn't really work well. So it is tricky, but it's now through this Internet of Things technology, it's solvable.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Martin. Just going to move on to the next question. Claudia Schöne, would you like to share your question? Okay. Well, Claudia's not in the room anymore. We're just going to move right along. Gabrielle Lang, would you like to share your question with Martin?
I think Claudia just came on the chat and said she can't unmute herself. So maybe you want to ask her question.
Okay, well, just go ahead for now since you're already on.
Oh,
please ask your question.
Yeah, so absolutely fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for that. Really interesting. And I just wondered, not to err on the side of negativity, but what do you think are the biggest barriers to us being able to use this data to its full potential? And what can we do about them, I suppose?
That's a really good point. I mean, we have that discussion right now, initiated by the Moore Foundation and also the Biologging Society. I think the biggest issue now is analysis. We need better real-time analyses. We also need more standardization on the tags and the sensors. Because right now, every company makes their own tag and sensor system, and it's very hard to compare that across different continents or species. But I think, well, and I think there's still people that have a hard time sharing their data, not for any reason, but they think it's just theirs. It's not the animals' data, because if they share data, they are not public, they're not open. It's just that it's much easier much quicker to make progress on global issues. So I think those are probably the biggest concerns. Also, to make really wearables for all of these different species, because we want to make absolutely sure that we don't affect the animals. That's the prime thing. If we would start affecting the animals in ways that changes their behavior or movement, our research and conservation efforts would be useless. So there are challenges, but I think there are a lot of people working on that, and it looks pretty good for that field right now.
Excellent. Thanks, Martin. Maybe then just quickly, if Claudia cannot unmute herself, she would like to know who owns the data. Maybe that's also fits with the previous answer.
So the data are always owned by the people who are sharing them, providing them. There are different ways of sharing them. You can either make them public or make them public with some restrictions, or only share them with a certain amount of people that are signing some sharing agreement. So people keep owning their data. It's not that MoveBank owns any data. We are just a sharing platform, or we help people share their data. And we are currently talking with the Senckenberg Museum. We hope that this database will be like a permanent collection in that realm of science, and that I think would make a lot of sense, because these data are unique. They've started about 20 or 30 years ago, before the major climate change, and so it's amazing what kind of information we get about these movements of animals around the globe.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jürgen Richt, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon. Jürgen Richt, Kansas State. Very interesting talk. You talked about movement and infectious disease, African swine and pigs, avian flu in birds. So not every bird who has a temperature has avian flu, and not every pig who doesn't move much does have African swine fever. Can you combine your micro technology with diagnostics for very specific diseases? We now do that with microchips diagnostics. Mm-hmm. Is that possible in the future? And so you can predict transboundary disease movement. Thank you.
That's a super exciting point. Yes, I think all that holds us back right now is just the mindset that, there's on the one side sort of the disease group, and on the other side the movement group, but now we have to bring it together. We have systems that do real AI on chip and also real AI on sensors. So Bosch and the University of Rostock are the key leaders in that field. We are working with them to put the AI on the chip for certain diseases. So we just need more analyses, more training data, and we need then the better connection to people like you who can do the chips and the real detection of diseases. I think then we are there.
Excellent point. Exactly. We need to bring these groups together. So hopefully we're moving one step in that direction today. Fantastic. Nigel Sizer, you would like to ask Martin a question.
Yeah, hi, Martin. Thanks for that fantastic presentation. I'm with Preventing Pandemics at the Source here in the US. I've got two questions. Can you talk about how you're collaborating with scientists in the global south and how you're trying to build capacity and involvement there? Because obviously that's so important here, given where so many of the animals of interest are. And talk a little bit about the funding needs, sort of the constraints you have with funding. What kind of levels of funding would allow this to really accelerate? Are we talking 1 million, 10 million, 100 that are needed to really take this to scale around the world? Thanks.
Yeah, super exciting. So we have an international grad school where we are getting people from all these countries where we work to work with us in Europe, in Germany for a while, and then go back in their countries to with the knowledge, and then we try to learn from them how to really understand animals, and they hopefully learn the techniques and technology. Now we have some interest from funders. It's called the interspecies group. They are actually trying to understand this interaction between wildlife or domestic animals and people. But I think the key is that we would need a system to read out these data globally. Now, these microsatellites now cost, say, roughly with launch, $1 million to $2 million, run for about 3 years. That's what we are doing now. But then we are also, hopefully, looks really good, getting these sort of old style or traditional style satellite, these star cruisers that allow much better technology and larger readout capacities. That's what's coming in 28. So that's, I think, a state-funded thing anyway, so that, you know, these satellite costs, you know, 2 satellite costs 400 million, but the small ones that are also really good cost only 1 or 2 million. Now, the tags is really what the people in the global south would need, and they are super cheap, you know, $200, and in the future maybe $100 for these devices, that would enable them to do all their communication with animals that they need and want to, and would give everybody else the opportunity to look into that as well. So I would think overall, I mean, if you compare that to I mean, any other large-scale infrastructure for other disciplines, it's ridiculously cheap. So it's often so cheap that the danger is that sort of the real deciding people are not even interested because it's so cheap.
You're muted, Kim.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, thank you very much, Martin. So now I'm going to hand over to Jerry from the Limbe Wildlife Center, who has a very practical question.
Hi, fantastic presentation. Thanks, Martin. Much appreciated. Yeah, there's a practical issue with, we've tried a little bit actually with tagging African grey parrots that we rehabilitate here in Cameroon, southwest Cameroon at the Limbe Wildlife Center. And we did actually talk, my predecessors, I took over here at the beginning of the year, my predecessors did talk to Max Planck. I don't know if it was colleagues of yours or a different section of it, but we had a lot of problems. We were trying with harnesses and they just picked those off. It didn't work at all, unfortunately. I wonder if you had some advice on, it looked like you get them so small now, you could glue them to feathers. I don't know how you managed with the parakeets that you showed in the presentation.
Yes, so I think we talked partially to them. It is a problem that for those species that have huge bills and are ferocious like your parrots, they can destroy everything. So you have to be incredibly inventive or trick them into, you know, accepting these issues or make them even smaller. So what we are doing now, for example, in storks, is to have leg bands, electronic leg bands. And these leg bands are done in a way that they replace the old style leg band that only has a number, but is now an electronic leg band. And maybe that is something that could be tested for the parrots as well. The problem is, we always say we need a global, I mean, a national lab or global lab that develops these things, because we only have I know 3 or 5 engineers in our team and working with industry to develop a few things, but capacity is super limited. That's why quite often these special applications for specific animals that need something very special or special treatment, they fall behind because we first need to do, you know, the general application and then go to the more special cases. So that is a problem, but hopefully with even smaller electronics in the future can be solved.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Martin. Kevin Smith, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Martin. It's Kevin Smith here from IUCN. I lead their work on invasive alien species, hence my question on invasive alien species. But I'm just wondering really if this work has, if you've thought about using this technology and work on invasive alien species, both because I think in terms of managing the risks that they pose in terms of health, but also in terms of actually managing the invasive alien species themselves, because I can, you know, their movement is often in novel environments, etc. So I just wondered if you'd thought about that.
Yes, I think that's super exciting. especially because what you just mentioned, that they move in novel environments, so you can test ecological theory, which would be sort of from a pure science aspect, super exciting, but it's also a very good applied aspect. And you have to be right. So your predictions have to be right. And I think that's a very good test for ecologists. So we always say, ecologists in the future could, in a way say everything, because it could be right for that situation. But we need to be general enough now to really have predictions that bear out in the field, in the wild, everywhere. And I think that's our challenge. It's almost like the engineers that have to build robots to show that their systems work. So we say, these applications have to work. If they don't, then probably our ecological understanding is wrong. So I fully agree. Invasive species should be a clear target of investigation and study and management.
Excellent, thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, there have been a few more questions from Claudia, but I think she dropped out and then got in again. And I think most of this you answered already. She's concerned about misuse of the system and the data. Can you maybe just say a few sentences about that potential of misuse?
Yes, I think that is a really important issue. We are constantly debating that in the background, but as I said before, I think the data during transmission can't be read because they are encoded. Later on in MoveBank, they are as safe as we can make it, and we haven't seen any misuse, but that doesn't mean that there isn't any. So we constantly have to be on the watch, like in all of these cases. But we are confident that we can, at least in most cases, prevent it, and so far have prevented it.
Excellent, thank you. Then I will just use these very last few minutes to, well, first of all, thank you very much, Martin. But I have a question also of my own, or maybe a topic that I would just like for you to maybe just briefly address for this audience, because as you know, as the International Alliance Against Health Risk and Wildlife Trade, we're particularly interested in trade, and you have touched a little bit on that already. But you've also done some studies on trade routes. For instance, you've used these your system to track trade routes, and how in your experience could that maybe be also extended to investigate illegal wildlife trade routes, etc. So how can we use that in particular also to get more information about wildlife trade and use? Thank you.
Well, I think the tracking systems now are so versatile and easy to use and global that I think these kind of systems can now be investigated, can now be studied, or can now be traced. I mean, obviously, we are not the ones really fighting crime during these trade routes, but if it's about investigating how animal parts are being traded, then I think this is a way how this can be done. So yes, even in fairly small systems, you always rely upon the collaboration of the local authorities in all of those places. But I think that's the usual thing. And if everybody collaborates, then I think these trade routes can be easily studied.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think you've given all of us in this room a lot of food for thought, a lot of inspiration. I'm sure there are many people in the room who want to think more about it, but also maybe have now seen opportunity for collaboration or just to see what's possible. So thank you so much for your time, Martin, and for giving us this incredible insight into your exciting work. Yes, so I hope we'll be in touch and continue to speak and to look into ways of working together. And I'm sure I can speak for many people in the room to say a huge thanks to you for your time and for sharing your exciting work with us.